And Major Garrett is in Tampa, Florida for us this morning. And Major, I know you said earlier today Mike Pence, in fact, is being dispatched to Utah, as reliable a Republican state as we've seen in the last 40 or so years. Meanwhile, both candidates remain in Florida. It'll be Donald Trump's third straight day in that state. I mean, when we start talking electoral math, obviously Utah is important, but is it really believed that without Florida there is no path?
There is no path without Florida. There just isn't. And the Trump people know that. Trump also doesn't want to lose his second home. He often refers to Florida as that. And they actually believe that they have a puncher's chance here in Florida. One thing the Trump campaign constantly reminds those of us in the traveling Trump press corps is Trump outperformed the polls on the Republican presidential primary. In fact, he did. He won by a much larger margin than the polls before that primary indicated. Now, that's a primary contest. A general election is a completely different animal politically. And there are organizational issues in Florida that beset the Trump campaign, as they are on almost every other battleground state. They're just not as well organized as Hillary Clinton. Now, the one thing the Trump campaign relentlessly tells us and always points to the large, enthusiastic crowds. We saw another one, several thousand, probably 12 to 13,000 here in Tampa last night. Those crowds are going to show up. People who are willing to stand in line for 3 or 4 or 5 hours, as they did last night here in Tampa, are going to vote. Be sure of it. And I don't doubt that, Josh. What I wonder about, and what the Trump campaign can't explain, and which we're going to have to watch and see, is there a larger echo chamber around this Trump movement that is bigger and more important than what we see at the rallies? Because if you're to judge the Trump campaign's success only by one metric, rallies, he wins. But rallies aren't the same thing as a turnout operation. They're not the same thing as bringing home a battleground state like Florida. On the organizational side, they're still behind. Last night we heard plaintive calls from the stage over and over and over, all the warm-up act speakers essentially begging people in the audience, register, volunteer, work your brains out, work your hearts out these last 2 weeks. Not the kind of things you typically hear from a campaign that is actually confident about its ground operation.
Perhaps that the enthusiasm to which they refer is one reason why the candidate has been thumbing his nose rather very publicly at the polls. He calls them phony. He calls them dark. Although it would seem a candidate in this position with regard to those polls, this might be the most conventional response we've seen from Donald Trump.
It is as conventional as we've ever seen in modern American politics at the presidential level, where polls are a constant part of the conversation. Every losing presidential nominee has said, you don't see what I see. You can't feel what I feel out there. The crowds are enormous. That enthusiasm tells me I'm going to win. We have internal data that's so much different and so much better. Michael Dukakis said that. Bob Dole said that. John McCain said that. Mitt Romney said that. Everyone who loses says that. And occasionally, and only occasionally, do you find that that actually is true. I mean, I remember the first presidential campaign I ever covered was in 1992. I didn't cover President George Herbert Walker Bush running for re-election. I was covering Ross Perot. But I remember down the stretch, Bush was drawing enormous crowds, 30 and 40,000, and that caused several reporters to wonder, wait a minute, is something going on? In fact, nothing was going on. He was getting large, enthusiastic, converted Republican crowds, but in the end, he lost in a blowout. So crowds cannot tell you everything about a presidential election, but for Trump, they tell him exactly what he wants to hear, which he has supporters and a life after politics at the presidential level if this doesn't work out, because one way or another, he's going to keep in touch with this loyal following. And
the campaign strategy, or perhaps lack thereof, has certainly been fascinating of late. He was given another opening yesterday after the Obama administration announced that Obamacare premiums would be soaring by double digits next year. I want to give you just a bit of what he had to say, get your reaction on the other side.
And in case you haven't heard today's news, it's just been announced that Americans are going to experience yet another double-digit spike in your premium for Obamacare, and it doesn't work.
14 days out, Major, can we expect to hear much more of the same here?
Donald Trump has, from the very beginning of his campaign, identified Obamacare as an enormous policy target should he become first the Republican nominee and then President of the United States. And it is utterly consistent with all Republican rhetoric about the end of Obamacare, or the imagined end of Obamacare. What's interesting, Josh, is many weeks ago, Trump had this conspiracy theory that this data would not be released before the election, that President Obama would try to do something to delay the release of this premium increase announcement, and saying, don't let them do that, don't let them mess with the system, don't let them rig it by delaying this announcement. It was never going to be delayed. It was always on a systematic schedule. Now it's out, and it is, as Trump and other Republicans have predicted, a bit of a sticker shock when it comes to premium increases. And Obamacare, at its implementation stage, year after year, faces more and more challenges. So much so that Hillary Clinton, the Democratic nominee, has said openly it has to be reevaluated. Protect, she says, what she believes works well with Obamacare, but also deal with its underlying problems with premium increases and reduction in the availability of care or the quality of care, something her husband identified on the campaign trail. And Mark Dayton, the Democratic governor of Minnesota, as Trump likes to point out, has said the Affordable Care Act is no longer affordable. So there is pressure about Obamacare coming even from Democrats. So it's a legit issue. It works very well for Trump. The crowds love it. And like a lot of Republicans, they know the future of Obamacare is up for grabs, especially if Trump wins this election.
Major Garrett there in Tampa, as always. We do appreciate it.
You got it.